This is chapter 19 in a book that's going to be called 19 Scripture Verses That'll Change Your Life Forever. This is based on 1 John 2:6, and 1 John 2:6 says, He who says he abides in him ought himself to walk just as he walked. So here's the Apostle John, who walked and talked with Jesus Christ, who understood who Jesus Christ was and had a wonderful encounter with Jesus, and was who he said in his own words that he was the closest apostle to Jesus. So he really understood Jesus. In John, in the Epistle of John, he says 3 times, if you love Jesus, you need to obey his commands. If you say you love Jesus, you need to obey his commands. He said it 3 times in the Gospel of John and 3 times in his letters. So John said that 6 times. If you love Jesus, you need to obey what he taught. And so that's a especially important message. When we come to this message, John is essentially saying, if you love Jesus, if you say that you abide in Jesus, then you ought to walk like him, you ought to behave like him, you ought to be someone that someone can say, he really reminds me of Jesus. I've been fortunate to hear 3 times in my life from different people that I'm the most Christ-like person they know, and I don't say that to boast. One of the people was my younger brother. He was saying to his daughter one time that, Matthew, your uncle is the most Christ-like person I know. And another friend of my family said to my mother that I was the most Christ-like person you know. When you start to hear that from time to time, you start to hear people say, your son just so reminds me of Jesus. You start to realize that this verse isn't just an important verse to you, but it's a verse that you're beginning to live out, that as you come to understand and meditate for years on the commands of Jesus, and you start to act those commands out, you become a person who becomes very aligned with the character and the personality of Jesus. It affects everything that you do when you start to behave like Jesus. It'll adjust your attitudes that you have with certain people, certain ways that you behave, certain ways you react to things. There's so many things that can distract us and come against us and cause us to have a reaction, and it's the grace that you show to other people in your reactions, the way that you react and the way that you perform. As a writer, this text is going in my 42nd book. I have many people who write bad reviews for my books and say they're unscriptural, unbiblical, and I'm a heretic and I'm a false prophet. They say all sorts of things, and it's the way I behave, it's the way I react to that proves the strength of my character. It's not how you perform in public, it's how you perform face to face with a person who's getting in your face and causing you trouble. It's how you behave in private that really counts. And many people can have a public persona, they can have a public image, but they can be terrible to their wife and their children, and people behind closed doors can really suffer because of certain people. So we need to meditate on this verse and understand that John didn't write the verse because he didn't understand things. He wrote the verse because he was behaving like Jesus. him and the other apostles were little Jesuses. They were, a rabbi would teach his students in those days, and his students would walk along behind him, and they'd learn everything the rabbi taught, and then when the rabbi retired or passed on, the students would go on and become rabbis and get their own students and teach their own students. Well, Jesus was a rabbi, and he taught. He was like a rabbi, even if he wasn't officially one. He taught his students, and his students became like him. They could be identified like him. If you met the Apostle John today, if you met him and he was out at a party with you or out at a church fellowship with you, he would remind you of Jesus. You'd think that you were talking to Jesus if you met the Apostle John. So we have to live a life that culminates and comes to a point where we're officially representing Jesus and we're like Jesus. It's important that you don't just live as a Christian in inverted commas, but it's important that you live as Christ, that you become Christ, that you become a small anointed one in your community, that you can learn to be able to be that tree that's planted by the rivers, who is sourced by the rivers of water, who gives its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither when the drought comes, like Psalm 1 and Jeremiah 17 says. It's important that you become a sustaining tree that can give fruit to people, that can give holy sustenance to people, that can bless people, that can provide people with everything that they need. It's important to become love in every situation and respond in love to every situation that happens to you. It's important not to be religious, bound up with a set of rules, but to be someone who's flexible, someone who's relatable, someone who's loving and compassionate in everything that they say and do. So it's important not to wear the mask or wear the face of Christianity, but what is more important is to demonstrate Jesus wherever you go and whatever you do. Do you know Jesus? You can find Jesus through understanding his parables, and you can read my book, The Parables of Jesus Made Simple, updated and expanded edition. You can read that book and understand what Jesus taught, and then start to put into practice the things that Jesus taught through his parables. When you understand Jesus, when you know Jesus and you understand him, you can trust him and you can obey him because you understand that he's true and he's real and he's right and he's smart and he's wise. The more you obey him, the more you realize how smart he is. And then as you obey him, you become more like him. And it's our goal in life to become more like Jesus. So I encourage you to ponder this verse, to meditate this verse, and think about this verse, and think that it's not impossible, because firstly, John did this verse. John participated in fulfilling this verse. I'm doing this verse. I'm participating in fulfilling this verse, and it's possible for you to fulfill it too. God bless.